Larry, there's a lot of talk these days about diversity, and in the wake of that Supreme Court decision, you wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post addressing what needs to be done. Let's first start out with what the issue is. We talk about diversity, but is that the fundamental goal? Is it to be diverse?
Diversity is important, but what's most important is inclusive opportunity for every American, the sense that we can draw on the talents of everyone, and the sense that our society isn't limiting anyone, regardless of what their background is, regardless of what their race is, regardless of how long they or their families have been in the country. That's really what is most important, and that's really a much more important priority for thinking about what universities do than is thinking about this idea that how good the discussions are going to be depends on exactly the demographic composition of the class. We're all very complex people. Our perspectives are not primarily the product of our race. They're the product of a totality of life experiences that we have had.
If you were advising a major university today, how would you advise them to pursue your goal of the opportunity to excel for everyone?
I'd start by eliminating legacy admissions and admissions for people who play sports that are highly aristocratic. Second, I'd make a big effort to look through people who've been extensively coached for the SATs or extensively coached as they wrote their essays and so forth, so that I wasn't giving credit for whatever your parents' money can buy. Third, I'd be thinking very hard about expanding the size of the class of my institution, because ultimately it's how many lives you touch and how many opportunities that you provide that calibrates your contribution. Fourth, I'd be focusing on what my institution or what any given institution can do to contribute to better public education and better opportunities for people before they get to college and people after the college years. Here's another example. Why not many, many more transfer students? If you look at the top schools, they take a dozen, maybe a few dozen transfer students a year. Probably students who have the kind of backgrounds that I had or that your children have, David, they probably have a full chance to show what they can do by the time they're 18. But there are people who don't have that chance, who get to a community college and remarkably excel. Why shouldn't they have the opportunity to transfer to one of our very top schools? If these schools admitted more transfer students, inevitably they would find themselves drawing from a wider range of society.
Larry, our great universities, such as, of course, Harvard, are much more than a business, but they are big businesses. Let's be honest about this. Are some of the things that we're seeing right now in the universities driven by the business model, as it were? For example, legacy acceptances. I've just assumed through the years that that's a fundraising device. Is that wrong?
That is often said. I think the evidence for that proposition is a little weaker than you might suspect. MIT has long been without legacy admissions, and it seems to do very well financially. I think this is one of those things where if any one school makes a move, its alumni are likely to be resentful and there'll be issues. But if this move happens quite broadly, I think people will see it just as part of society moving to be fairer. Just as many years ago, it was the case that top schools had huge preferences de facto for students who'd gone to elite private prep schools. And that was often defended by saying they came from wealthy families and it could support the schools. But those policies gave way. And I think everybody at schools like Harvard would say they are much better off because those policies gave way. And I'm pretty confident that a decade later, no one would miss legacy admissions and people would take it as a given that legacy admissions were not part of our system.
Larry, flash forward to a world in which the major universities embrace your goal of equal opportunity for everyone and also adopt some or all of the ways that you have of achieving that. How will we know whether it's succeeding? How do we measure it? I'm not sure, looking back at what was a so-called affirmative action with race and ethnicity, I'm not sure we achieved the goals that were originally sought. How would we know going forward whether we're getting the job done?
I think we would look at the leading institutions of our society, whether they were great hospitals, great schools, great law firms, great companies and businesses, and we'd see whether the people who were leading them were, as much as is true today, people who came from very privileged families, or whether the people who were in leadership positions came from a much broader swath of society. I think we would look at how American public school kids were doing compared with kids from other countries on standardized international tests. And we'd be looking for that kind of progress. You know, David, in a much more elitist age, the Duke of Wellington famously said that the Battle of Waterloo had been won on the playing fields of Eton. Well, I'm here to tell you that the battle for America's future will be won or lost in America's public schools. And just as any great company pays huge attention to its supplier network, our great universities need to be paying huge attention to the public schools in their region and the public schools around the country. And we haven't really cracked the problem of public education in the United States, and perhaps we can get some new ideas, get some new infusions of talent, get some opening up if this is a challenge that our great universities are more prepared to take on.